Hello, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is August the 11th, 2025. Today, Mercury is stationing direct in Leo in an opposition to Pluto and Aquarius in an orb that is not exact but off by about 2 degrees. And with this in mind, what I've been thinking about is Pluto having to do with a certain element of secrecy, a certain element of espionage, stealth, maybe even conspiracy, that kind of stuff. And what a Mercury retrograde has been. We're at this point where Mercury is stationing direct, meaning that it's slowing down and about to go forward. And in the process of this, keep in mind, for one thing, that Leo, when it comes to all this political stuff going on, Donald Trump has Leo rising and Mars in Leo. And so there's certain things going on that I find are usually subject to a certain kind of basic level of repression, in that I would just like to acknowledge, first of all, that one of the big things in current events going on right now is the Israel war and occupation of Gaza, and apparently there's a lot of controversy going on right now on the announcement of that apparently Israel is just planning to go even further with their project to just completely take over Gaza. And there's this kind of issue in which it's a kind of like a catch-22, because if you were to take a opinion on this in a number of directions, for example, even if you were to be pro-Israel, there was something about being very pro the Israel agenda would be very controversial in a certain direction that would perhaps be even worse than being very against it, right? And they're basically the sort of like, where is the liberal consensus central point of what is supposed to be an acceptable opinion? And it seems this seems to be if you take in a certain opinion, does that automatically make you into a terrorist, a hostile threat to free democratic society, just because you take, like, there seems to be no, it sort of is like a, for the sake of making these videos, I just find that part of it to be uncomfortable to deal with, something that I don't, or that, it's also the slippery slope to ethnocentric identifications, and that, to speak frankly, like, where do you think my ancestors were? They're a bunch of European anti-Semites, probably the worst of them, right? So I'm not going. I basically want to uphold the liberal principles of not backsliding into these kinds of prejudiced things or whatever. Or also, there's, in the midst of all this, the problem of the culture war. You have real war, which is not a joke that you don't want to joke around with. You have the culture war, which seems to inherently slide very quickly into real war if the people involved in the culture war are self-described fascists. There's another thing that came up around the Mercury retrograde in an opposition to Pluto, was the controversy around platforming fascists, and specifically stuff. I think that the platform Jubilee, or the YouTube channel Jubilee, is in itself a kind of like a hazard, in that, like, I think watching this kind of a content, which so explicitly puts these polarized political dynamics in a very theatrical, spectacular kind of way, in a very clickbaity, addictive consumption style of content, I think this in itself is hazardous and then the platforming of fascists is just another thing. You know, there is the people. It's true that some of these people that have been platformed by Jubilee have lost their jobs, but this is basic. There's this issue about censorship and freedom of speech that's also been playing out with this whole debacle around the censorship of certain video games, or at certain age restrictions online and stuff like this. All this stuff. So you have the culture war, the censorship war, the real war, and the trade wars with tariffs, with Donald Trump in having signed some deal with the EU that apparently does not seem to be a very good deal with for the EU. I guess you can always renegotiate these things later. Carney is playing more hardball than the EU is. Carney, our Canadian Prime Minister, that is. And we're not signing a deal that's a bad deal. It would be interesting to see whether Canada has the balls to lay down some of our more heavy hardball negotiating tactics, such as cutting off the power to Detroit, which apparently Donald Trump is apparently that's off limits. They don't want us to cut power. They don't want Windsor to cut power to Detroit because that's just playing dirty, basically, right? So Canada has a whole bunch of dirty tricks up our sleeve that we could roll out on this if need be. It's kind of entertaining to watch at this point. There's a certain kind of perverse entertainment to the whole situation, I must say. In the midst of all this, I also have to say that when it comes to my own content creation for this astrology channel, that part of my choice to focus on doing astrology videos rather than doing other things, such as maybe, I don't know, I was considering starting a booktube channel, but then I realized that there's probably a whole host of problems that probably go with trying to do that. But I've also realized that statistically, the videos that perform well on my astrology channel tend to be the ones where not the ones where I try to like fit in all this like literature that I'm reading that doesn't have anything to do with astrology. This could be part of the structural content of YouTube, where the idea is that if you are marketing yourself a certain way, that you're focusing on a certain thing like astrology, people are not interested in what kind of philosophy books you're reading or something like that, and that it's perhaps more appropriately designed to separate all these things out into different areas, right? But there's a reason why I'm doing it this way, which is basically because I find it's a good way for me to approach the topic of synchronicity in a way that rather than being a liability for me, where as a person who may experience more synchronicity than usual, then I'm not somebody who's just diagnosed and labeled and or like there's some kind of I'm some sort of like freak who has to be separate from society. I can actually use this things being kind of overloaded with symbolism in a way where I can actually make some money off it sometimes, right? But the thing is, I have to admit that this also, it makes the process of reading books and more interesting than if this was otherwise, because especially when the books are laden with multiple symbolic associations, multiple references, all this kind of stuff. And I have to admit that if you go back to around the time my dad died in 2013, at that point in time, I was on a lot of antipsychotic medication. I was heavily sedated and all this kind of stuff. And I nevertheless bought a book called The Bleeding Edge by Thomas Pynchon around that time. And I've been a big Thomas Pynchon fan for a while. And there's something about there's a lot of stuff things that could be talked about that just don't seem to uh, fit well into like the social container of everyday life. And in this particular circumstance, like I had just been going through some stuff where I had a mental health crisis. I quit my job. I moved back in with my family. My dad died, and then there was some kind of like thing about the consensus reality that I inhabit with my family and the real reality of the world and the ability to educate yourself to have a more informed vision of what's going on in life versus this, like with Mercury opposite Pluto, there's a certain kind of like quality of like, I think like I remember listening to the astrology podcast and Austin Coppock was talking about like True Detective, right? Or like this idea about like going into the like it's like a detective story and you like go in deep and you're like over your head or something. But there's something about the general this idea of the conspiratorial depths or whatever versus it seems like a lot of people live at this level where things are basically, because of what I'm saying, there's a natural tendency to repress certain things, to not talk about controversial topics such as the war in Israel with Gaza, or the culture war, or the even just talking about the trade war becomes a pain in the ass, right? There's kind of thing where it's like people, if you have like thinking about things and thinking about the problems of the world is a certain kind of, it takes a certain amount of mental energy, it takes a certain amount of work. And when you actually, when it comes to living a happy life, then you might just be better off not thinking about things, right? But then this sort of creates a situation where it feels like a very shallow, superficial kind of consumer society. And then what ends up, like, if I'm just gonna be like, okay, well, instead of being, I'm not gonna worry about politics, I'm not gonna worry about war, I'm not gonna worry about all these problems in the world, and I'm actually fairly well off, so I'm instead just going to like, collect like synthesizers or whatever, and then just like become hyper self-aware about like, oh no, I'm just like, my life is really shallow and there's no meaning in life, and I just buy stuff and I just like, I'm on this addictive, there's plenty of meaning, but the point is it's like people don't like to like, when, there's something, it's kind of funny because it's just like, where I don't know, there's also this kind of thing where there's certain synchronicities that if I approach astrology, there's a way I could do it in such a way where I could like present the overwhelming meaning and symbolic this symbolic chain which hooks everything together with all these meanings in a way that is actually, it could be a like an entrepreneurial business project, which is, I mean, kind of redeems the whole mental illness of it if you can make some money off of it, at least in theory anyways. But the problem is that I tend to just want, like, I'm more interested at this point in time, now that it's 2025, to go back and read books like this and to try to, I don't know, maybe I'm still just a moron, maybe I still just don't get it, right? But there's certain things that, like, while I'm going to give you an example here of what I'm trying to talk about, is that while I was reading that book, there was, in the room where I sit on the couch and I tend to read books, directly across from me, there is this box that I'll show you. I took this box off the shelf. This box is basically, it's basically full of some like guitar strings and like some random like chords and stuff like this. It's like, after changing the strings on my electric guitar, here you can see it like this. You can notice that this is a box that says Driscoll's on it, and so like I'm reading this Thomas Pynchon book. And and there's a character in it. The thing is, what I've realized about Thomas Pynchon is that every name in the book is going to have some kind of symbolic meaning. And I just have this uneasy feeling reading this book, and there's a character named after this fruit company that I'm sticking my electric guitar strings in, and just a random junk or whatever, right? And it's just like and then To give another example of this morning, I'm taking my dog for a walk, and last night I was thinking about how I was talking about Pluto and Aquarius and the age of Aquarius, and this idea I've been working on where what if the age of Aquarius started in 1997? Because there's actually, if you look at Carl Jung's Aeon, there is a specific reference point to two different dates for age of Aquarius. One that's a couple hundred years, or it's like we've got at least a century or two to go before we get into age of Aquarius, or else there's a certain star that you can use for the age of Aquarius that marks it at 1997 that times up perfectly with Neon Genesis Evangelion, and that there's something also which this book also makes reference to the Metal Gear Solid games a lot, and I have to admit, when I was that age, this is basically, it's about September 11th, the turn of the millennium, everything leading up to that, and at that point in time in my life, I have a certain kind of like being a kind of elder millennial. Not quite Gen X, but being an elder millennial, I played Metal Gear Solid, the first game, but then I never played Metal Gear Solid 2 or Metal Gear Solid 3. And so that there's this whole thing that people who are either slightly younger or more into video games than I will know. Apparently Metal Gear Solid 2, I'll link it in the description. I found this video that talks about how Metal Gear Solid 2 revealed the secret plot of the Illuminati or whatever. But they talk about the Patriots as the shadow government, basically, right? And so everybody, these kinds of things. There's this kind of funny situation going on where I think what gets around in like internet pop culture is like there's this kind of quality of like mystification, right? Of like certain things that are like not there could be legitimate conspiracies, but there's a certain kind of level of mystification that happens, and that if you are literate, a lot of the mystification, I think, it comes down to mainly that America has very poor literacy, very poor media literacy, very poor and it's basically we've also have this society where there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of repressed and not talked about in a kind of mature, civilized way. And then someone said we live in this very kind of fragile consumer, like we build our personality on our ego, on our consumer preferences, and then we try to basically repress everything else and just stay in this sort of like self-soothing, like I'm just gonna buy things, it's my special, I'm gonna like another special treat today, I'm just a narcissistic consumer, and then everything else is like, oh, it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? And then so then the problem about like I don't want to what makes book talk, maybe this is why I don't want to get into book talk, right? I guess I kind of like weaving around here. I guess there's other point about this though is that you may have noticed in recent in the news there was this guy working as an FBI director with this name Driscoll, and he was fired. It's like, what does that mean that this guy working for the FBI has this name that has been sitting on my shelf while I've been reading these books? And like, why is there some sort of synchronicity there? And then if you also, the other one is that if I'm watching these videos about, like in Thomas Pynchon, he's talking about more Metal Gear Solid than I even know about, right? And then like how Thomas Pynchon is trying to like make these hints that Metal Gear Solid is somehow onto the secret conspiracy or something like that, and that the Patriots they use the same kind of visual language as the in Neon Genesis Evangelion, Cele, the secret committee that is like control, and you can watch these Gnostic conspiracy people. I mean, there's a whole, there's probably a whole sub genre of YouTube video where people get really into this kind of stuff. But there's the what is interesting about it is that it reminded me that even Serial Experiments Lain talks about this with the Majestic 12, and there's this whole idea that with the whole UFO disclosure thing, that there was a secret like committee of like 12, shadowy, I don't know who they'd be, oligarchs or people behind the scenes, and these are the people who are given the truth about the aliens, and there's a whole secret, the shadow government, right? There's some real Alex Jones stuff, right? But there's this kind of question about like, for my own sake, basically I just bought this book back in 2013, decided not to read it for over a decade, and then finally got around to reading it. And as I'm reading this, there's the weird synchronicity of the Driscoll guy. I'll give you this one. There's one weird synchronicity, and then there's also the fact that I, for the hell of it, decided to Google search Majestic 12, and then this morning I'm walking my dog, and there's a van parked where I normally. I'm used to seeing the same cars around and where I walk my dog every day, and there's this car that normally isn't there that is a van that has Majestic written on the side of it, and I'm like, what the, like, how, like, I don't normally Google search or YouTube search Majestic 12, but then why is it that me searching for that makes this synchronicity where there's a van that says Majestic on the side of the van, right? And that why is that there's this Driscoll guy in the FBI, and I have this thing here, right? And it's like, there's some weird stuff going on, right? So I'm taking a chance here. I'm taking a chance to at least give you a few little nuggets or tidbits of interesting things going on. I don't know how it all adds up. I was also considering reading a portion of this, but then I realized, I don't know if this, it's up to you maybe if you want to try to read Thomas Pynchon and put it together. But I did notice that they're with all this Epstein stuff going on, that he's got a character named Vip Epperdu, which is obviously VIP is like VIP, very important person, and Epperdu, the do is a residual of. And then you've got a lot of things about in the plot line about this character about like having, oh man, I don't know. Maybe I should just read some of it. But it's kind of, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know if I'm just getting myself in trouble, but this is just, like, what are you supposed to, like, maybe this is the problem, is that like, I'm kind of resisting doing the book talk thing because it seems like a lot of like, people who are basically identifying with their consumer habits or identifying with like a certain like, like there's a certain kind of a niche marketing demographic that is, you can, it's like reading the room, right? It's like, there's this whole kind of, and I accept that there's a certain ecosystem of a demographics of what, but there's in the midst of all this, there's this huge question of like, is literature dead? Are men don't read anymore? Women just read a bunch of trash, and here's an opportunity for you for a bunch of men who feel like they're frustrated for being decentered. They're now a bunch of frustrated, decentered white guys are going to wave their book collection around, identifying with their consumer habits, occupying a position of superiority, and talking about how like the women's minds are being corrupted. But meanwhile, there's like you've got this stuff about like, I don't know if I want to read this is I don't know if I want to read this on my YouTube channel. You guys but you just have to you can tell though that I don't know what this part it kind of highlights this kind of problem where you've got obviously a certain class of people in society who are literate and also mature enough to talk about things which could be uncomfortable or whatever. And then you have a kind of an illiterate consumer class, which basically treats everything that's outside of what they of this with a certain level of mysticism, right? Where there's this very small kind of bubble world where you inhabit, and then the thing, everything out that is put outside of that inhabits this level of just thick mysticism, where it's just like your common everyday consensus reality, and then some weird Illuminati stuff, right? I guess it doesn't help that that Epstein had a literal weird temple thing on his island, and he has all sorts of these weird, like, the press releases are filled with all kinds of just disturbing symbolic, imagery and stuff like that, secret codes and stuff like this, right? But the thing is, if you're literate, it shouldn't be that hard to just connect, doing this connect the dots process. And it creates the problem about me trying to be an astrologer, I also have to admit, in a moment of self-reflection, is this perhaps a false, like, it creates this scenario where if you kind of look at what the algorithm feeds you and what gets popular online, and like, why is there this opportunity to just like take something without, I don't want to be condescending too, because like the thing is, maybe I'm just the moron. Maybe there's a lot of other people who are mature, literate people who can read a book like this, understand the symbolism, understand the references, and then I don't know what you do with that, especially if you read that 10 years ago, so there's all these people who have just been kind of like, there's obviously a certain class of people who are like mature and literate and know what's going on, and then there's the rest of us, which are just a bunch of narcissistic consumers who are basically insecure about our, we have to like show off our consumer buying habits and have everybody either approve or disapprove of them with likes online. And then there's the people who actually know who probably know better to talk about this stuff in the first place, right? But then between that, a level of thick mystification where it's either a very black and white, this is what normal people believe and think about, and this is woo-woo la la land, right? And there's some opportunity, I feel, to at least develop this a little bit, so that it's not but it starts to feel like there's maybe an intentional repression or whatever, right? An intentional I have to admit, growing up as a millennial in this era, there's a certain the era of anti-intellectualism. It's like is growing up in this kind of atmosphere where you could overthink things, or else you can just relax and have a good time and appreciate things, enjoy life. But for some reason, you would think that it would be much more complicated to think about things and much more simple to let it go and enjoy life. But then apparently it's actually really difficult to do this, right? Apparently actually like taking it easy and just enjoying life and having a good time when there are mass genocides, huge oppression, like the fascists are taking over. It's actually kind of difficult to do this when that's the context of the situation, right? Or that if you are able to do that, then you start feeling like self-conscious that maybe you are just enjoying life on the back of other people's suffering and it's unfair or something like this, right? And then, or maybe is that too woke for you? I don't know, right? I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. What do you say? Where do I go from there? Anyways, I don't know. This is what's on my mind, anyways. As Mercury stations direct, and there's also this premise. I have to admit, the psychology of I don't know, just this psychology of like consumerism, materialism, trade, or the fact that we live in a pretty affluent society, and that I have this weird conflicting thing where I feel like, because if I wanted to, I could just keep buying synthesizer shit in this really but living in this strange narcissistic bubble that's cut off from everything else going on in the world. But then you try to, like, as soon as you start, dealing with the people, and I don't know. It's like this kind of thing where there's this problem. I've been thinking a lot about this problem, basically about consumerism and materialism, where there's a lot of things where it's like whether it's like, you could not, it could be all sorts of things. It could be like clothing, it could be like gadgets, it could be all sorts of things for entertainment. There's something about it where it doesn't matter about what it is or how, or if you're consuming the right amount. There's some basic point where it always just feels disappointing, or it feels superficial, it feels shallow, because you're living in this narcissist world where you're like, how do I tune off from all the bad things in the world and just indulge in my own self-gratification? And then you get hyper fragile to anybody criticizing that, because this is the little castle you've built for yourself, where you surround things things you make you feel good, and then you feel like any attack on that is just a mean-spirited ploy to make you feel bad about the only thing that gives you joy in life, and then you just have to face you're actually a shitty person underneath it, right? Versus so I don't know, there's a certain I don't know, that this is my, and there's something also about this Mercury retrograde, where there's also I've also, I don't know if it's because there's this sort of drama going on between like, do men read or not, and there's this pattern that's come up around this about performative masculinity, where it's like, apparently it's not just performing as in being like an athlete or something like that. They're talking about performing for a certain kind of female gaze, where you're trying to virtue signal somehow by reading books and drinking matcha. And it's like, this was actually what I was doing during my lunch break back in like 2007 or 2006 or whatever. I would be, there's this kind of question of like, if you're working a job and you get a 15-minute smoke break, you could have a coffee and a cigarette, and then people might give you dirty looks for being a smoker, or else you could get a green tea matcha drink and read a book or something like that. And I don't know, it's at least seem to be some kind of improvement over just having a coffee and a cigarette. And there's some kind of criticism going on that this is obviously just a ploy to impress people who don't who categorize one thing over the other. But meanwhile, both of these things are probably subject to a lot of price inflation due to the trade war, because coffee is expensive, tea is expensive, all this kind of stuff. There's the other thing about performative masculinity is that they're not the guys who are drinking green tea and matcha aren't reading Thomas Pynchon. They're reading these like self-improvement books, like the Laws of Power or like Atomic Habits or so. And like, there's something about the making that, well, I mean, there's something about like that whole market of like those kinds of productivity or like self-help books, or like there's this idea that like, if somebody says, they're gonna focus on like self-improvement, like that's what they mean. There's something about all this where it's like it's like a certain style of self-improvement that is like self-improvement for the sake of impressing your boss or something, right? It's like self-improvement for like how to make yourself a more productive, obedient worker or something, or else people who are so frustrated with working in that framework that they need to become an entrepreneur or something to give themselves an alternative or whatever. But I really don't understand like what's the appeal, or like there's something about the that whole dynamic, which is obviously your whole project of self-improvement, is in the face of a certain power structure, which I'm bringing this up in terms of like Mercury, Pluto as like the trend, or first of all, the criticism of men reading books as performative masculinity, but then the books are always these weird self-improvement books or whatever that are all about like atomic habits and self-mastery and like how to be Machiavelli or something like that, right? Like there's like those kind of, for some reason, why is that performative? Like, why is showing off that you like shitty self-help books, like, who is that impressing, right? And that it's like, I don't know, maybe there's this problem where I've seen this attributed to, it depends on what your preferred kind of ideology is, that if you're really into psychoanalyzing people and diagnosing people, you may see that this is a product of narcissism in our society, in that basically your efforts to self-improve are basically to appeal to a narcissistic value system, to like how to make yourself useful for your narcissistic boss, your narcissistic manager, or how do you earn brownie points for your narcissistic parents. And then if you can do that, you've successfully completed the self-improvement project, which is another version of the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, right? Where your whole life of how you're directing your energies to be a good person is basically to the will of the master who has power and control over you. And like, if you do what they like, they give you a gold star. If you do what they don't like, they scold you or whatever, right? Like, it's just repeating it rather than anybody having any. And then if you break free of that, you now have you guys ever seen this show Red Dwarf, about how the guy comes out of cryogenic freeze, and then he has to have the hologram of his friend harass him for the rest of his life? It's like that, basically. It's like imagine that your self-improvement project is that you have this annoying hard-ass guy who's always trying to like impress the boss or point out your mistakes and point out how and it's like you have this fucker, like you are alone, you're isolated, but you have the ghost phantom of some spirit like constantly being like, oh, you didn't do this right, you didn't do that right, oh, and like I've got all my the kind of person who wears like underwear suspenders underneath his clothes and everything's like prim and like that's like you have to like perform how much of a slave you are to that mentality and like whip yourself with, oh, I'm not good enough, I need to self-improve, and then you have to be like, oh, like every time if you have a certain project that you're interested in and you don't get quick results, you have to be mature enough to just either rebrand, figure out how your like this is a constant image management, right? Is it okay to have like that I have a piano behind me, that I have like a jazz poster behind me, that I have synthesizer? No, it's because it's not on topic for astrology, right? If you're doing astrology, is it okay that I'm talking about fucking Thomas Pynchon in my astrology video? No, you have to start. You have to do. You have to have a channel for doing books. You have to have a channel for doing synthesizers. You have to have a channel for talking about philosophy. And then if you try to combine them all in one thing, then you're just fucking it all up, because if somebody's going to be creating an algorithm where they're going to be, this is actually, I think, part of why I like doing this is because I don't think the algorithm likes astrology, because it wants to be able to scrape all this information about you probably don't want to be talking about serious stuff and then suddenly go, whoa, Age of Aquarius, whoa, Pluto, whoa, Neptune. It's like they want to be like, okay, they want to have like, or if you want to make a video and something does well or something does poorly, you want it to be very specific so that you did well because you made a reference to one thing that people like or didn't like, not to have a whole bunch of things mixed up together, right? They want everything sort of individuated and separated out into these discrete components. So basically, you're doing a lot of labor for some fucking fuckers, some rich billionaires' neural network, and you just get to be some poor schmuck, and they get to make all the money off of you, right? And then and then you get to be ostracized and alienated because you're more concerned about something other than simple consumer habits or whatever, right? And like it's just or else it just reduces every single thing you do into like some dumb consumer like look what I bought today. Look guys, I did a book haul. Look guys, I did a music gear haul. Look, I bought a whole bunch of bullshit to redecorate my background. Some of that like how or like you do a little like survey like of like how to cater to your demographic audience and all this, right? Okay. Which apparently I just don't care about. This is my resistance. This is my display of resistance to these structural dynamics with the medium itself. Make of it what you will. Thank God Mercury retrogrades are over. Thank God I don't live in the EU or wherever. I don't know. May we have a... I guess it could be worse. Hopefully things get better. Hope you're all doing well out there. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.